Hey everyone, this is Louis7, and in today's video I want to revisit an old topic I had on the Red Line Beorning in the Lord of the Rings Online. So a couple of years ago I made this video talking about the Red Line Beorning Problem, as I called it, essentially discussing why I think the spec is fundamentally flawed and does not have good gameplay systems to make it a fun class given what I think otherwise has really fun abilities and has really nice flavors and just well-class fantasy. So this video I made was about 2 years ago in June 2019, and one of the ultimate results of my in-depth dive into the class and spec was that the Red Line Beorning felt like it was still in development, kind of like a beta or even alpha state. And yeah, it was just an incomplete class, is essentially what I took from that in-depth dive. And this, of course, was a major bad review for the premium class that you have to buy that was added to the game almost 5 years earlier at the time in November 2014. But in current times of September 2021 now, the class has been in the game for nearly 7 years. So with this video, I want to explore this topic on the Red Line Beorning and see how it has changed. And I think this also has important implications for the Brawler, because if the Beorning can still suffer from major issues for so long, do us players really have any reason to believe the Brawler will turn out to be better? But we'll save that Brawler topic for later, and to go ahead and point out, the background gameplay will be mostly of the Red Line Beorning, but I'll actually mix in some Blue Line gameplay, especially towards the end of this video. And for people less familiar with maybe the two specs with the class, I'll also have an indicator on the top right section of the screen for which spec I am in. So let's go ahead and go back to the original Red Line Beorning problem. And the context for that video is it was made partially in response to a revamp of the Beorning class at the time. Before that update and before that video, I think the class overall with all three specs included felt like it was kind of in this incomplete state, and to use the term again, it kind of felt like it was in kind of this beta state and just needed to be finished. Well, the update changed some of the core systems to the Beorning. Some of the primary changes we saw was moving Thrash from a Wrath consumer to a Wrath builder, and also it changed the functionality of Wrath in bear form. It used to be that you would just passively lose Wrath over time in bear form, and after that update you would actually passively gain Wrath in bear form, which is how it functions now. And just to point out, most bear forms do still consume Wrath. And I thought this update improved the yellow line gameplay feel and greatly improved the blue line gameplay feel for the Beorning. And today I would still actually agree with that statement. While I certainly don't think either spec is perfect, and I do think they could use a little bit of rework, they both did feel much better compared to before, and I thought were a lot more fun. And for me personally, I still love tanking on the Beorning, I will say. But what about the Red Line? How did that change? Well, I actually thought it changed for the worse ultimately, and that spec still made the class feel incomplete and actually less fun to DPS on than before the update somehow. And ultimately, the Red Line Beorning problem, as I called it again, was that the Red Line Beorning did not have any meaningful Wrath consumers. And there is more to it than that, but that is where I think all the issues with the class kind of stem from. And today, 2 years later, I believe all these issues are still a part of the class, and that there just have been no improvements made over all this time. The class really hasn't been updated, besides some balance tuning, which this is kind of irrelevant towards the balance of the class and spec. And unfortunately, if we do look into the future with the Brawler, I don't think it really inspires hope from a player perspective. If there are issues with the Brawler, I can't really be optimistic about it being fixed, considering all the issues plaguing the Beorning for all these years just going unaddressed. But with that Brawler topic, that is where I will end with this video and perhaps pick it back up in a future video. And for the rest of this video, I want to break down the Red Line Beorning problem in a bit more detail as it is today. And for anybody unfamiliar, just some basic gameplay with the Red Line Beorning, they actually prefer to stay at high Wrath mostly. To main, there's this capstone trait that gives them high crit chance and crit damage with that. You prefer to stay at high Wrath for that mainly. Additionally, the Red Line Beorning doesn't really have any good Wrath consumers to just deal damage with, outside of a couple strong skills but that have fairly long cooldowns, so you can't use them all that frequently. And then even those ones that are strong and consume Wrath, they don't consume that much Wrath overall. And those two skills, to actually name them, are Bash and Relentless Maul. On top of that, for most fights when Relentless Maul is on cooldown, it can actually be better to just stay in bear form because outside of those two skills, damage in man form can actually be higher, especially if you choose to dual wield. And just for bash, it can often not be worth switching to bear form just for that skill. This is, of course, have some differences in longer fights where you definitely want to apply bash, but you can actually refresh it in man form anyway, so that's also a bit odd and another point against switching into bear form. But anyway, this whole thing creates another issue with the flow of gameplay where I am rarely motivated to stay in bear form, and I feel stronger in man form on my skin changing Beorning. I stress the feel because I have done some tests on my Beornings, and for the most part it is actually true. Man form is really strong outside of those two skills, Bash and Relentless Maul, and I'm really highlighting Relentless Maul because that is probably the strongest skill the Beornings have. I also just believe this to be an inherent problem because if I am playing a class that can turn into a bear, I expect to be a lot more powerful as a bear than I am as a man. I also expect to have more cool things to do as a bear than as a man again. But I don't really find that to be the case with the Red Line Beorning. Turning into bear form is boring to me, and I just don't think that should be the case. And on top of all of that, with the building aspect of the class, many of the traits on the Beorning, especially in the red line here, the focus of this video, feel useless or boring. Execute, which is a whole trait line in the red line and basically a dedicated skill that you're supposed to build around in the red line, is actually useless. Like, it is actually worse to pick Execute, which is an active skill, and to use it in combat compared to not doing that and just say like standing in man form using your 4 basic abilities compared to using Execute and spending all those trait points on that line. And just to give some extra context on the trait line in general, I only picked 10 out of the 16 lines in the trait, and lines in the trait tree rather, and this leaves almost 40% of the entire red line unused because they just aren't very useful traits there. So this feeling all of this creates is that the Red Line Beorning is just missing some things. It's like the class, as I've mentioned, is still in development and just needs a few things added to it, and then maybe a round of finishing touches and just other general polishing things after that. And then after all of that type of stuff, I feel like it could finally be a complete, like, fully developed, well-rounded, non-alpha/beta class. And as usual with a video like this, I will get into some ideas I have for what could be added and changed to actually make the class a little bit better, of course, in my opinion. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and do a quick live demonstration to showcase what I'm talking about and compare it to the blue line. Alright, so the camera might have changed a little bit as I move into this live session, but basically what I want to do is look at the red line and just get a general sense of flow of the gameplay and a look at some of the problems. So in man form, you have these 4 basic abilities. They build wrath and do a little bit of bonuses, do some bleed damage. As I have maybe mentioned, dual wielding is a lot stronger for man form, and two-handed is a lot stronger for bear form, but in general for DPS redline, it is good to use a two-hander, even though weapon swapping would be optimal. We're going to go ahead and ignore that for this point. And basically, this is the general flow of man form, just using, I'm not doing it too rapidly, but using these abilities, and then switching to bear form. The wrath consumers we have is technically beast form is one, that is a really strong one, but you can use it in either form. I believe it's slightly stronger in bear form. And then you also have bash is one I mentioned, but it's 12-second cooldown, cost 20 wrath. So that is one. We have expose actually as to wrath, but you do have a benefit of using it in bear form if you want that specific debuff compared to the man form debuff. We also have Relentless Maul, Brutal Maul as it gets changed to, and while I do have some other skills, that is another thing we're going to point out, is that is due to blue line and yellow line traits, not red line traits, which I believe is a problem if you need blue line traits and yellow line traits to make your Red Line Beorning actually feel normal with its gameplay and gain extra abilities, and these still aren't perfect with that, but that is something I want to point out because I do have more things on my bar. One other one is actually going to be the Interrupt, which is Vicious Claws, but again, this is one you can use in any form, but it does cost some wrath and has a 12-second cooldown, and is kind of useful to use anyway because it can also refresh the duration of bash and animation cancel like that, so you can really quickly get through your animations. But anyway, if I go in bear form, basically the gameplay is kind of rough just using those abilities. Here's Relentless Maul that has a long channel duration, but yeah, there's not too much without using all these extra skills, which even that I could use. We'll go ahead and use some of the ones I do have traded. And just to look at, say, the immediate damage on Bash, we already have that up, and compare it to Thrash, it's not that much more, so it's not like this is a skill that's very useful to use and very exciting to use very frequently, also considering its long animation. So just another thing to point out there. But before I get way too rambly, we'll go ahead and stop this live demonstration a little bit, at least for the gameplay here, and move to looking at the traits in the blue line that do help, and the trait in the yellow line that does help with a sense of flow of gameplay. Now, takedown is not that strong, but it is something that adds an additional button, which I think is quite helpful. One problem is it has a 30-second cooldown, so you can't use it that frequently. And there's a similar thing going on with Armor Crush, which while it does provide a valuable debuff, plus 15% incoming damage, and it interrupts inductions, it has good uses, especially compared to Takedown, and just does more damage. It still has a 16-second cooldown. And I also believe, as a Red Line Beorning, you shouldn't really have to go get blue line traits and yellow line traits both at the same time to help the flow of gameplay in bear form. Now, for the next section of this video, I don't have it set up. I'll set up the blue line and be right back. Okay, so before we actually switch to the blue line, I realized I didn't really show any real-world examples. We were just at a training dummy, and I had to access that one because I don't actually have one for my yard, which is a better training dummy. So if I actually go into just this instance to get some quick combat and try to get a little bit of decent gameplay, maybe this can highlight what I mean. The problem is this character is really strong anyway, but if I go into main form, you can see things die pretty quickly, and again, doesn't motivate me to switch much when I can kill things this quickly in main form outside of the couple of strong skills. So if we actually use these strong skills, which again, Brutal Maul, Relentless Maul here is really strong. And then Bash would be another strong one, but again, that one is primarily over time. If we look at the actual damage it deals, most of it is in over time form. He's not like immediately going down pretty quick, and it doesn't help that I'm stunned here. But yeah, basically this fight I think could be a good example of like a real world scenario. Wanted to get the AoE from Fighting Edge there, and again, might as well just stay in main form at this point, and everything dies there. So just an example there to get a little bit more gameplay, but we can actually go ahead and switch to the blue line for real. Alright, so this is just for reference my blue line trait setup that we'll be using for this, but that is not too important, and what is more important is the gameplay flow. So I will start it in main form just to get off to a similar foot as we would in the red line. Go to remove that debuff and switch to bear form. And the biggest thing is while I'm in bear form, especially for a longer fight like this, is I always have things to do. Always have Thrash to rotate, and we have something like Claw Swipe, which is a short cooldown Wrath Consumer that we do not have anything comparable in the red line, and I can just use that on repeat and have enough extra stuff to do that in addition to this one simple skill, the gameplay flow, I believe feels a lot better than what we were achieving with the red line before. Alright, so I hope that live demonstration did help a little bit, but to summarize a little bit with what we saw, the key gameplay element that I feel is missing is meaningful wrath consumption. Flavor-wise, I also feel like compared to the red line, there are a lack of bleeds. Like Claw Swipe does bleed the enemy there. And I know this is an extra subjective thing in an already subjective video, but I believe it would be in line with the Beorning to add more bleeds to the red line, it would give the spec at least more synergy and just stronger bleed theme. This could all be done by adding one or two more Wrath Consumers, perhaps something just like Claw Swipe from the blue line to the red line, and I know I personally would find the spec much more fun with even that simple of addition of a single low cooldown Wrath Consumer that of course would have to be impactful enough, and it would motivate me to basically stay in bear form and not feel weak in bear form at the same time compared to man form. And aside from adding new skills, I won't go into too much details on like specifics here, but one thing I would love to see return to the Red Line Beorning is execute procs. Back in the old days, if traded in the execute line, you could get a proc for execute where it would basically not consume wrath, it would be a free execute. And I think this could be returned to the red line to just add something exciting to the gameplay. For example, this could work as maybe like whenever you use a bear form skill, you just have a small chance to unlock the use of execute and make it free, another motivator to stay in bear form. I'm also usually not the biggest fan of RNG with something like that, but I do think proc skills, like this example at least, usually don't play out to me with like feeling too random, and it's something that's fairly limited that I think is exciting, and I just think it would add some fun to the Red Line Beorning if it was brought back. Moving on, some other suggestions I have for improvement would be to work up the traits a little bit to make them more thematic and more exciting, perhaps repurposing some of the same more like useless ones. Especially again the execute line, because it really does just feel bad when you're on your Beorning and half the traits, it seems like at least, half the traits just feel not that helpful to you. But let's go ahead and just move on, and to summarize with all that, I think the class, and more specifically of course the red line spec on the class, could potentially be fixed and no longer feel like it like basically belongs in beta. It actually feels like it deserves a spot as a class in the game with these adjustments. And briefly, I do want to talk a little bit about why I think all this is important and why it's just such a big deal to me. And I think it's pretty simple. I want to enjoy the Beorning. Based on its class fantasy, on its animation, sound effects, and some of its just abilities it has, the skin changing system, and the fact that I can just play as a bear. Based on all of that, it is a class that I should enjoy, and it should just be fun to me, especially to play as a DPS as a bear mauling things. But to me, it is not, and I do believe that is a big problem, which is kind of why I'm making a video about it. It's also a class that has felt incomplete for nearly 7 years now. I don't think that is a good look for the game, especially as we do look into the future, with the Brawler coming later this year, actually getting pretty close-ish to it, that with it being September. And with this, I just get filled with a sense of dread that the Brawler will feel incomplete and underdeveloped as well. I also believe this is something that is important to the players of LOTRO, of course. One thing I have not yet discussed in this video is what the community thinks about the Beorning in this topic. So again, I made a video 2 years ago, and while I do appreciate any new comments on this video to hear everybody's perspective on the class and spec now, okay, so I ran into a random issue with OBS, but it looks like I continue where I left off, and basically, from my video 2 years ago, the original one on this problem, a lot of people agreed with me on the comments, and at the time it was one of my more popular videos before my channel has like relatively blown up the past year or so. But anyway, it was one of my more popular videos. It was a video that received an unusually large amount of likes, and all that basically indicated to me that a lot of players felt similarly on the issues and perhaps at least agreed that the Red Line Beorning could use some loves with updates and reworks and the such. And also the final reason for this video is on the off chance that someone maybe at Standing Stone Games actually watches and takes in the feedback. And one of the, I guess the big reason I mentioned this is because the new producer for LOTRO mentioned the possibility of larger class reworks next year in 2022. And I really think the Red Line Beorning should be a strong contender for something to get updated and reworked, of course. And depending on how that actually does look in a year and how that pans out, we may be due for another follow-up video in 2022, and hopefully it could be positive then. But until then, that is where I will leave you all with this video and this topic. Again, I would love to hear your all's thoughts on the Red Line Beorning and basically what you think of the issues that I raised in this video. I really appreciate the responses people left from the original 2019 video, and I'm excited to see what people do think nowadays in 2021. And with that, I also hope you all did enjoy this video and maybe learn something about the Beorning here. And if you did, please consider liking and subscribing for more, or becoming a channel member to support the content and commenting your thoughts. And thanks for watching, everyone.